Welcome back, everyone, to this, our last session of the day. And this is our panel called What Gets Published and Why? I'm delighted to welcome today's panelists who will lead us in our thinking on this topic. Do invite all four of them just to switch their cameras on and say hello to you all. We have David Shervington from SCM, Cade Jarrell from Baylor, Laura Morris from Brill, and John Boyd from IVP. I will introduce them all in a little bit more detail as we go along. So our panelists are going to speak for about 10 minutes each, and then have about 20 minutes to ask questions of each other and to discuss anything of interest that has come up in the four presentations. And then at approximately 5 p.m, we'll take a break of about 15 minutes. And during that time, you're invited to submit your own questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And at 5:15, we'll reconvene to allow the panelists a chance to speak to some of those questions. So to begin, I welcome David Shervington, who is the Associate Commissioning Editor at SCM Press. David has worked in academic publishing for 12 years, mostly focusing on theology and religious publishing. And David is going to be speaking to us about how publishers venture into new areas and the dilemmas that they face when doing so. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Helena. Good afternoon, everybody. So just to start, really, firstly, just thanks very much for inviting us together. It's a really unusual thing, I think, to have a publishers panel at a conference like this, but I think really important for reasons which I will get to in due course and will become apparent. But just to start by giving you a bit of an idea of who SCM Press are. We're one of the leading independent theology publishers in the UK. We've been around for an unknown amount of time, about 100 years. Since I came on as associate publisher, we have tried to do a bit of digging to try and find out where our origins were, and they're a little bit blurry. But we know that if you track our books back far enough, you'll see books through both world wars, through periods of huge societal change. And the common thread is that they're all dealing with how the concerns of the church and of wider society, how those kind of interrelate with theology. And as part of that, naturally, we've been known really for publishing from and about different kinds of voices that often are marginalised. We were known, for example, for publishing some quite innovative work in liberation theology in the 70s here in the UK. And more recently, of course, we've published people like John Hull, whose experience of theology, whose theology was drawn from his experience of blindness, a theology from rather than a theology of disability. Our focus now is on what we've kind of loosely described as cutting edge voices. That's not necessarily young voices. It can be, but folks who are speaking from what we see to be the kind of the leading edge of theology and different fields within theology. And we've been excited to discover in recent years that there's been a bit of a resurgence, a bit of rediscovery of some of those liberationist theological perspectives, a new generation of theologians doing some really important contextual work. I mean, all of theology is, of course, contextual. Lots of it just doesn't realize it, but that theology which kind of owns its context and sees that as a really critical part of how it's working is, I think, where we're really interested. It feels to me like there's not just a kind of pastoral need for this kind of publishing, but there's also a recognition of the voices that we've collectively ignored. And when I say we, I mean churches, I mean the academy, but I also mean publishers. So we need to be, for example, taking autistic voices and experiences seriously, both to resource the church to be able to talk intelligently and well to the whole of society, but also simply because when any one single perspective isn't represented, when I look down my publishing schedule for the year ahead, and I see any voice missing, and in a broader sense, as all of us involved in the kind of ecosystem of theology, when we see voices missing, theology is the poorer for that. That's why it matters. But what I wanted to focus on, particularly in this kind of short time I have, is what I think is a bit of a dilemma at the heart of publishing. And my colleagues on the panel can correct me if they don't identify this. It may be just me. But I think it's a dilemma that I think is quite relevant when it comes to an emerging or field. And when I say emerging field, I may well mean that we're just realizing it's been there all along, and we, been sort of ignoring it for too long. But a field like that of thinking about autistic experience, it comes down a little bit to what we've already explored, and what we may well explore later, I think, in this panel. What are our priorities as publishers, and the challenges of publishing into an area that is still evolving? And I think a couple of my colleagues might be speaking to that in due course. I see it as a bit of a chicken and egg dilemma, really. We naturally have parameters around which we can or we can't publish. The thing about a book is that it makes its market, by which I mean, although we talk about a book having a particular market that it is aimed at, that market is always theoretical. It's always just our hope for where the book is going to go. It's not like a journal. The thing about a journal is the journal knows its market before any of the articles are published. There are people that subscribe, and that's who we're writing for. The difference with academic book publishing is that we don't have that. So a book doesn't have the luxury of a known market. Publishing is speculative. It's a speculative business. And so as publishers, we're basically trying to calculate risk. And our job essentially is to manage risk. So when we're publishing into a fresh area, that risk is potentially all the greater because things are a little bit untried. The question as a publisher that I have in my mind is, has theology moved to a point where it's ready to buy books about a particular field, about a particular experience? That's the calculation that I think I have to make as a publisher. But there's a flip side, and the flip side is, and this is why it's a chicken and egg dilemma. On the other hand, I'm aware of the difference that a book can make. It can actually set things going a little bit. On a completely different topic, some of you may have come across a book we published recently called Ghost Ship, which is a book about institutional racism in the Church of England. I think it's a book that helped to change the narrative a little bit here in the UK Church and the Church of England especially. Now, when I signed that book up, I don't necessarily think the church was at a point when it was where there was no risk in publishing that book. The Church of England hadn't yet, or at least hadn't for some time, stood up and described itself as institutionally racist. There hadn't been that conversation. Now, obviously, last year in 2020, that conversation became something that was much more live, but at the point at which I signed the book up, that wasn't the case. And so there was a risk in publishing that book. And yet the reason we went with it was because we knew it could change the narrative. We knew it could change the conversation and do good. So I suppose what I want to say is, although we are risk managers, although we are trying to calculate whether a book will work, whether the market is sufficient for a book to work, we are also genuinely trying to make a difference to a particular field. And so, to come back to thinking particularly about publishing within theology and autism, that's, absolutely the motivation behind some of the books that we have published recently. So you will have heard already, I think, about these books, but Ely Campbell's Motherhood and Autism, which is this sort of honest, moving accounts of the experience of mothering and autism, but tinted with a theological lens. But it's not sort of restricted or hemmed in by that lens. It sort of uses that experience to speak into the theology rather than the other way around. Autistic Thinking in the Life of the Church by Stuart Rapley as well, which takes a very different, much more sort of practical approach to thinking about the experience of worship within a church context. And then, of course, Claire Williams' book we have coming in sort of a couple of years' time, which is a liberation and theology of autism. And the hope is that all of these books will actually help to change the narrative. They're very long overdue. And as I think I've hinted before, it's an indictment of the theological publishing scene that such important books would be considered risky. But as I've said, the reality is that they'll only help to change the narrative in theology and the church if those fears, if the academy, if the church want to listen to those voices. It's got to be symbiotic. As publishers, we have an absolute responsibility to be publishing these voices. But I think the way out of that chicken and egg scenario isn't just us publishers stepping up, being innovative, publishing unheard voices, and taking these exciting developments and areas in theology seriously, but it's also theological institutions taking a long hard look at their reading lists, for example. And I'm aware of the time. I've just come to a close here. So I think if us as publishers can work closer with you, and this would be my sort of leaving message, if we as publishers work closer with the academy, with the church, with those sort of at the leading edge of these kind of conversations, there are some really exciting possibilities. But those really exciting possibilities depend on us as publishers and on tutors setting books on reading lists, on these conversations becoming common currency. I think that's where I'll leave it, because I can see that I have run out of time. But I hope that gives you a bit of a flavour of some of the dilemmas that are at the heart of publishing in a field like this.
David, thank you. And I hope you'll get the chance to expand a little on some of that in the discussion later on. But thank you. You've got us off to such a great start. I love what you say about a pastoral need for certain kinds of publishing. That really stood out to me. And also looking for the voice that's missing in the ecosystem of theology. I think that's a really powerful image. So thank you so much. So next, I'd like to invite Cade Jarrell, Assistant Director of Baylor, and also Managing Acquisitions Editor. Cade is a graduate of the Baylor's Truett Theological Seminary and has been with Baylor Publishing for 7 years. He's got a particular interest in New Testament studies, church history, and contextual theologies. Cade will be speaking to us about how Baylor would like to build on their existing presence in the disability and theology field. So welcome, Cade.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you, first of all, to our friends at Aberdeen for allowing us this opportunity to partake in such an important panel. Let me begin by saying that Baylor University Press's aims in publishing in this particular area of autism and theology, we hope to align that with the aims of our Studies in Religion, Theology, and Disability series. Brian's book, which is featured on the flyer for this conference, is part of that series. This is one of our most successful series. It's generated a lot of positive feedback. We are proud of its accomplishments under the editorial guidance of Sarah Melcher, Amos Young, and now John Swinton. That series, to my mind, has set the template for the sorts of works we would pursue in this area of autism and theology. So in line with that series template, we would be looking to publish works that incorporate or engage multiple disciplines, biblical studies, historical theology, systematic theology, contextual theologies, psychology, social sciences, philosophy, and of course, secular disability studies broadly defined. It has been a point of pride for that series that our authors are at the cutting edge of these cross-disciplinary conversations, that the research is current and cognizant of the breadth of the relevant scholarship. For that series, ethnography and direct testimony are key components with a determined focus on actual lived experiences. The goal is to platform the voices of persons with disabilities, disorders, divergencies, and the experiences of those close to those persons, so that these issues don't remain academic abstractions, but they remain grounded in the realities of actual people. Concomitant with that aim is the goal to bridge scholarship with a prophetic message for the church. The idea is that these should be resources that practitioners can utilize to inform their ministry and their common life as part of the Christian community. So we have only published on the particular subject of autism once with Grant McCaskill's book, Autism and the Church, back in 2019. Grant's book does a wonderful job of setting groundwork for what we are looking for, even though it's technically not part of that series on theology and disability. In particular, it is very self-consciously and intentionally primed to address these pressing real-world questions that are being raised in our communities of faith as autism becomes more visible, and as we are beginning to find the conceptual frameworks to better understand autism. What is also useful about Grant's book is that he emphasizes the way to approach this is not to equip believers with a few verses that could be wrangled to directly address autism as a medical condition, as though the ancient writers of our sacred texts actually had the same sort of perspectives and insight that we possess in the modern world. We're not trying to read autism back into the foundational texts of our faith. What we are doing, what we hope to do, and what our series on disability and theology has done, and as a guiding principle, is to draw from the resources of our tradition responsibly, to allow that tradition as a whole to form us and to shape our modes of thinking and of being. The foundation that we build from those resources should be this holistic model that informs our interactions with autistic persons in ways that respect their full humanity and their full inclusion in the body of Christ. And going beyond mere respect, it should also shape us to recognize them as equal members in the work of the kingdom. That foundation should also allow us to legitimately incorporate autistic persons into the church's communal mission, and to help us navigate both the unique challenges and the unique contributions that autistic persons bring to the table. A major part of this approach to the texts and to the witness of our faith heritage entails allowing scripture and historical theology in conversation with these other contemporary disciplines, allowing all of that together to challenge our value systems, to call into question our hierarchies of worth and esteem, to upset the precious status quo that still is so entrenched in our churches as it is in our culture more broadly. The aim here is not so much explaining what disorders like autism are, or figuring out how to work around these issues or find special accommodations within an existing order of things. The goal here is really about shifting our vision, our priorities, in other words, letting the gospel do its work. That is the kind of confessional scholarly spirit that we want to see in books on this subject. And of course, it's equally important to us to provide resources that address not just neurotypical Christians who have questions about autism, but books that address autistic Christians themselves. What does Scripture speak into their situation and any of the myriad attendant challenges that can make fitting into church and society so daunting? How does the language of theology help these people make sense of their experiences, make sense of their sense of self? How do they find their place in the narrative of faith? So, we want to give room to scholarship that is directed toward those very personal questions as well, and enables this particular community to see their neurodiversity not as a deficiency to be redeemed or transfigured or what have you, but as a valuable and valid component of their identity, a piece of their being as individuals created in the image of God, and a beautiful uniqueness that enables them to play a role in the larger mission of the church, a role that others cannot fill. Finally, I will say that we recognize how critical it is to foster scholarship that is sensitive to the conventions of terminology and classification, the current medical standards. But at the same time, our primary goal with our books, again, using the disability series as an analog, is not to definitively settle any debates about how to clinically speak of and categorize these issues. Our main interest is to explore these spaces for faithful engagement within the church with the people who experience realities like that of autism. So I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Cade. How interesting that we began with David speaking of a pastoral need for this kind of publishing, and we've continued with you speaking of a prophetic need for this kind of publishing. It's really interesting to hear. And also just to pass on a comment in the chat from Grant McCaskill, who of course is one of the founders of the Centre for Autism and Theology. He's grateful that Baylor University Press was happy to carry his book outside the disability series, recognizing that for some autistic people, they prefer not to see themselves as disabled, and just allowing that space was gratefully received as well. So thank you so much. So we turn now to Laura Morris, who is the Senior Acquisitions Editor for Religious Studies and New Testament Studies at Brill. Sarah has worked for Brill for 6 years, and before that held positions with Bauer and with Cambridge University Press. Sarah will be speaking from the perspective of a publisher that's looking to move into this field. And so as such, she's picked up the title of our session for the title of her talk, What Might Get Published and Why? So Laura, we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? I can't see, yes. And you can see, okay, lovely. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Please do let me know if this doesn't work. Can you see that okay?
We can see that okay.
Perfect. And does this work? Is that can I change my slides? Yeah, okay, got it. Thank you very much. I will get started. So yes, hello. As you've already heard, my name is Laura. I have responsibility for the Religious Studies publishing programme at Brill. For some of you may not be particularly familiar with Brill, so we are an independent academic publisher with a very strong focus on the humanities and some social sciences. We were established in Leiden in the Netherlands in 1683, so we've been around a very long time, and we now have offices all around the world. We publish more than 360 journals and typically more than 2,000 new book titles each year. Primarily, these are high-level monographs and edited volumes. Sometimes this includes multi-volume major reference works like dictionaries and encyclopedias, as well as online databases like scholarly bibliographies, that sort of thing. And they're all written for a readership of academic researchers and postgraduate students. So they're the type of books that you generally find in a university library rather than in the classroom or amongst the general reader. And we cover slightly more niche topics than maybe some of my colleagues here today. As things stand, we do not, as Henna said, we do not have a particularly large portfolio of titles that explicitly focuses on the study of autism and theology, although we have published on autism and also on disability studies more generally, particularly within our education and our philosophy programmes. I've included a couple of examples on this slide here. If you have any questions about them, you can always reach out to me afterwards. So central to Brill's mission statement is the belief that the humanities are really vital areas of scholarship for addressing today's global challenges. The research that we publish can and really should impact society and hopefully help find solutions to the important questions of our time. And this is why we have recently become a member of the UN's Sustainability Development Goals Compact. And I don't want to sound too high and mighty, but this is new and exciting for us. And I've included 2 of those goals on the slide here because I think they're particularly relevant to the discussion today, as they really do shape what we publish and why. So the first of those is about the importance of providing scholars and students with access to relevant and high quality research. So I'll read that for you. It says, Brill aims to advance learning in the humanities and social sciences and support scholars by providing them with access to the finest research tools and reference works in their fields. So if you can't see the slide, it's an image of the globe with a word map superimposed. It's religion in the middle with all related terms around the outside, like spirituality, science, healing, monotheism, culture, that sort of thing. So my own commissioning focus is religious studies, broadly conceived, rather than specifically theology. So forgive me if I speak slightly at a tangent to your own particular interests, but I do find that religious studies is a truly interdisciplinary field. So current research, I find, is dominated by the interplay between religion and key adjacent disciplines. And we see lots of work that is applying the theories and methodologies of, for example, theology or philosophy, sociology, anthropology, to the study of religious beliefs and religious identities and even religious institutions like the church. And these can be really fast evolving topics. And I have to keep on my toes to reassure that what we are publishing really keeps pace with the field. So as a result, a lot of what Brill publishes is determined by you, because the best way for me as an acquisitions editor to survey the current trends in any academic field is to speak with scholars and to attend conferences like this one today, so that I can learn who is working on what's being published where, and also what our core audience is most interested in reading. So in the photo here, we've got me and some of my Brill colleagues at the AAR conference in the US. And if you see us at a conference, please do come and tell us what you're working on, what you're interested in, even if you're not ready to publish, even if you don't want to publish with Brill. It's always a valuable conversation to be had. And if talking in person is not your thing, just drop us an email. We'd be really glad to hear from you. But as a result, in recent years, we've published quite widely on the interactions between an increasingly secular society and religious ideas, as well as the transformation of sort of social and political institutions like citizenship and gender norms and education under the influence of religion and vice versa. So we publish quite widely on, as you can see here, on these covers of books and journals, on religion and education, religion and psychology, religion and politics, religion and gender, all of which I would suggest are so-called sort of frontier topics that are timely and expanding quite quickly. And there's other topics which I feel are conspicuous by their absence from our portfolio, and studies at the interplay of religion and autism, as well as religion and disability studies, more broadly construed, is just one of them. And this relates to what David was saying earlier about whether the market was being ready. Personally, I'm seeing more attention being given to the topic. In the summer, there was the Disability Studies and the Bible panel convened at the ISBL, which was online. Just last week, there was the Neurodiversity and the University panel hosted by Chase. And I was really delighted to be invited to join today because selfishly, it gives me a chance to learn more about the field and what is being published and what might still need to be published. So to circle back to that slide again, I'd like to talk about the second goal, the reduced inequalities one, which says Brill is working towards ensuring diversity and inclusion across all stages of the publication process. Brill also adopts best practices for website accessibility and strives to adhere to guidelines and recommendations to improve accessibility. So in recent years, diversity at Brill, and I think across many publishers, has really been embraced as a core value and a fundamental priority within publishing. So certainly we've made serious efforts, as have many others, to consciously make changes which address persistent disparities, particularly where gender and ethnicity and increasingly sexuality are concerned amongst authors and editorial boards in certain academic fields, and indeed in many areas of life. Certain sectors of society face various barriers and biases, and as a result are underrepresented. And as a publisher, as it's been said before today, it's really important that we work towards better representation, that we draw our authors and editors from the broadest possible pool of talent, because that is how we can work with the brightest and the best and really promote the true exchange of ideas. And it's easy for me to sit here and trot out buzzwords like representation and inclusion, but it's really important that people with diverse identities are included in the scholarly conversation if there's going to be genuine advancement in the field. So it's important that we publish books and articles not only about autism, but also written by and reviewed by people who are stakeholders in that field, who are personally affected, who have the relevant expertise and experience. And I wanted to finish by saying a few words about open access. And this is less about what gets published and why, but more about how. But I think it's equally important here. Open access is something that Brill and many other publishers have been investing in significantly, with the aim of widening the dissemination of books and articles. And this means making research publications freely available online so that everyone can have immediate and unrestricted access to the latest research. And this is a much more equitable way of publishing that helps us to accelerate the scholarly conversation. Not everyone will publish in open access, but one of the best reasons for doing so is that open access publications, on number 2 here, are downloaded more often, and they're also cited more often and more quickly once they're published. So in research, which is about the autism community, and has the potential to impact the daily lives of the autism community, it's important that that scholarship is accessible to individuals. And it's only in this way that we can be sure that future research can influence and help prioritise research initiatives which will have the most needed impact and really effectively progress the field. So there's lots of sources of funding available for publishing in open access, and whoever you're publishing your research with, it's well worth having a conversation with your editor to see what possibilities are open to you in order to make your research more visible and a true part of the ongoing conversation in this area. And that's it. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was excellent. I think it's really good to get someone coming in with the religious studies perspective, because that's quite often what pushes theology towards these frontier areas as you describe them. So thank you for bringing that to us. So last but certainly not least, we have John Boyd, who is the Associate Publisher for Academic Books at InterVarsity Press USA. Before coming to IVP, John held positions at Encyclopaedia Britannica and at North Park University. He works on acquisition and development of books for IVP Academic, covering a range of subjects, including history, culture, psychology, and the sciences. So perhaps unsurprisingly, with such a broad range of interests in mind, John will be speaking to us on the interdisciplinary nature of publishing in disability studies. So welcome, John. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Hannah. It's a real treat to be here. I want to throw in a few thoughts here about books in general, maybe. I can tell that I'm among book nerds here. It's really an honor to have heard from 3 folks at other publishing houses already. I can tell there are kindred spirits here, and I bet we should have a very interesting conversation coming up. So I want to pull back a little bit and talk a bit again of throwing a few bigger ideas about books in general. And the first word, I guess let me share my screen here. The first word I want to put up there is conversations. This is really a question for me of noticing that all kinds of different conversations happen in and through books. And in a context of an academic conference like this, I'd like to focus on two sorts of those conversations. One is among yourselves, as scholars, as specialists, as insiders of one sort or another on a topic. Books have unique powers to foster conversation, not just across international boundaries, because Zoom could do that too. We're doing it right now, but of course across disciplinary boundaries, across even the centuries. We're all of us as scholars involved in conversation with people long gone, and we're better for it, as well as the newest and cutting edge stuff. A lot of that is about sharing. And, being able to go to the library, being able to go to an open access journal, as Laura was just talking about, all kinds of sharing where the scholarly ethos is one of cooperation and collaboration. But I'd like to focus particularly on a concept called brokerage. And I just want to put that word up as well as a key book reference that I'd love to recommend. The reason I use the word brokerage, it's not like real estate or stock trading necessarily, but it's more a concept from the sociology of social capital and intellectual capital. And the book that I mentioned there, Ronald Burt's Brokerage and Closure, I don't get me too excited about it because I'll go on and on, but the concept here is about spheres of knowledge where in one closed network, there may be people who have special language, they talk only to each other, and they get really powerful things done with that. A great example, this might be something really technical like air traffic control. Most of us don't know how to listen to air traffic control radio. They have particular terms, but it gets the job done, right? We don't need them to explain it to us. They just need to land the plane. Please, we'd like to land safely. Brokerage happens when there are multiple closed networks, and then someone starts learning across. The sparks start to jump from one side to another. And that's a different kind of conversation, and it's one that books are especially good at. Footnotes show you where the sparks are jumping between one thinker and another, and often that's between one whole field of study and another. These are some of the conversations that come first to my mind when I heard about a conference on autism and theology. There are multiple fields represented here, and many more fields represented in the broader concern that do us well and are very stimulating. We've been using the word interdisciplinary a lot already in this session. You might call it cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, whatever prefix you want to put on it. This is where a lot of the action is in book publishing. I'm convinced when the sparks start jumping between those networks of knowledge. A second kind of conversation that I want to focus on just for a second, though, is what you might call translation. This is when someone, an author and then a publisher working with them, starts to bring a specialized conversation to a wider audience, or at least a very different audience. This might be an audience that could benefit from conversations, say, about autism and theology, but may not be so focused already. It may not be focused yet. That's kind of the key question. The specialists might be up to their ears in the topic, talking with one another, generating lots of really important insight and meaningful material. But it becomes a translation task once the question starts to be, well, how do we interest others and engage them in the concerns that they have here? And this may be preaching to the choir here as an example of translation, but let me just give you the simplest example: a word like neurodiversity. Very familiar term, I'm sure, to everybody in this conference. But I guarantee you, this is not a common word, in conversation on the street, not a common word in many conversations in our churches or other religious communities, often not even a common term in other fields of academic study. So the translation task needs to ask a lot of questions and answer a lot of questions. And they're sort of like the good journalist questions. What is it? What is neurodiversity? We need to help guide people into understanding that in terms that they follow. Why does it matter? And then maybe especially, how would we proceed with that knowledge? What matters about it? Who cares? So what? And that, of course, will vary by audience. Pastors, for instance, may have a different way of engaging with a concept like neurodiversity. Family members will engage with it in a different way, et cetera, et cetera. So for all of these kinds of conversation, I'm sure it goes without saying that we need patience and we need listening. And that just seems like such a key word when we're talking about book publishing. A reader has an opportunity to listen, to slow down, to engage, and to read hundreds of pages of someone else's thoughts, as well as creatively engaging with them in their own way. So I think it's a dimension that we shouldn't leave out of our considerations of what gets published and why. How can we as publishers listen to authors? How can we listen to readers? How can we listen to one another? It's one of the things that's really an honor about being on a panel like this with other publishers. I should also say that not every conversation becomes a book. That goes without saying. There's a long tradition of publishing, for instance, conference proceedings as books, but that often doesn't work as well anymore when conference access is easier in different forms with video or other things. And of course, it probably goes without saying, but it does need discernment, and some of my fellow panelists have already identified some of the dynamics in that, and I'm hoping we'll talk about it a little bit more. Let me say a little bit about that discernment really leads to the right book at the right time. We at University Press, on both the academic and the trade book side, have several books on disability out through our history or forthcoming. And we're always looking for the right books at the right time. That's, of course, a judgment call. But I think some of my panelists have already addressed some of the dynamics in that, and maybe we can follow up in conversation and in the Q&A. I just want to, in closing, put up a little bit of contact information on our website there, as well as my email address. But let me say a few things about us. We are a U.S. Publishing house. I know that there's an University Press UK. We are friendly with our friends in the UK, but have been always been separate companies. We just have a very similar name. We in the U.S., our academic imprint is AVP Academic. We are an affiliate member of the Association of University Presses, putting us in company with academic scholarly university presses that operate according to some of the same principles that we follow: peer review and addressing concerns that either the conversations remain within the academy, or at least they originate there and are built on scholarly conversations. In particular, in this area, we're in partnership with the Center for Disability and Ministry at Western Seminary in Michigan in the US. John Swinton is one of the directors of that, as well as Ben Connor, who is based at Western Seminary. And we don't yet have a book out in that series, but one is contracted, and our ears are open for other conversations. You can tell from the name of that, the Center for Disability and Ministry, it's one of these places where there's a conversation happening across disciplinary boundaries that might otherwise separate the opportunity to have conversations. We publish a range of things from scholarly monographs to general leaning translations of the sort I've been talking about, and in a wide range of fields, from theology to business, biblical studies to psychology and history, all kinds of things. So just to tell you a little bit about who we are. But I'm interested in conversations, whether they're through books or email or conferences like this, and that's why my email address is up there. Feel free to reach out and get in touch with me.
John, thank you so much. It's really good to hear about the conversations, those different circles of engagement. So your sort of internal conversation among academics, but also the public facing conversation, just put so clearly in terms of what kind of books are needing to be written and why. So, and I think some of what you say about looking for common language and terms that will work both within the academy and externally feeds into some of what was covered this morning in our earlier sessions. So it's really nice to pick that theme up again. So we have about 15 minutes now until 5 p.m. just for our 4 panelists to have a conversation and allow us to eavesdrop. So if I could invite them to pop their cameras on and say hello to us again. And if anybody has a thought or a question ready to go, then we're happy to lead off with that. So you can just start waving at me frantically. David, thank you. Go ahead.
Can I fire a question particularly at Laura? Because what I found interesting is there's a big difference in the kind of worlds we're in. Laura's publishing within a publisher that concentrates on quite a wide range of different disciplines. And SCM, our focus is well, our sole sort of reason for existing is around theology. So I wondered if you could kind of explore a bit the kind of the strengths really of being a publisher. This is a very generous question for me to ask, by the way, of being a publisher, you know, that of a wide range of different disciplines, and what we could all learn about being sort of kind of not putting things in silos, which is very easy to do as a publisher if you work in one particular area.
Thank you. Yes, that is a very generous question. Well, to be honest, at Brill, I occupy the best of both worlds because I am working for a publisher that publishes across many subject areas across the philosophy and classics and area studies and social sciences and law, history of science, so many, which is fantastic. Equally, we are a humanities publisher, and having previously worked, for example, at Cambridge University Press, where we published across the whole of STM and English language textbooks and those sorts of things, where humanities publishing was very much in the minority and far less profitable than those big streams. I'm certainly very, very fortunate now to be with a press that really prioritises my subject area and related disciplines. I think it's been beneficial for my programme in terms of religious studies because of the cross-marketing opportunities that we have. I mean, obviously, we publish for a very different audience than you. We're publishing for a library market exclusively, I would say, and not for the general reader, not for use by churchgoers necessarily. So I definitely benefit from having that broad scope, a bigger pool of authors from which to pull and for which to ultimately cross-market the products that we produce. Does that answer the question?
It does, yeah. I mean, I think that I'd always very, feel it's worth us being honest that there are strengths in all directions. So I do think there are strengths to having lots of different disciplines in one house. I also think there are plenty of strengths to being to having a focus, but I think that there's a place for both of our kind of styles of publishing, and particularly I think with something like this where it's so easy, isn't it, when you're saying, well, we're going to publish a book about autism and the church, autism and the theology, and that's where the butt stops. But actually, that's not how life works at all. You know, that we could publish a book, that has a kind of LGBT, autistic, author. There could be a whole, people are cross-sectional. There's a whole range of different identities, and the ones we happen to pick up on as publishers aren't necessarily how people define themselves either. So I think it's worth us acknowledging that sometimes as publishers, because we do have a tendency to silo.
Just on the subject of identities, then another comment from Grant McCaskill, which I said I would share if we had a good moment in this section. I'm just reading it, so give me a moment. So one of the key factors in defining values with an academic publisher like Brill is the makeup of the editorial board. So Grant has taken up a role as a joint series editor for one of the book series is there. And one of the priorities has been assembling a board that is appropriately diverse and inclusive to ensure good recruitment from underrepresented groups and a peer review process that is intentionally decolonialized. Brill has been working actively to do this. I'm sure that kind of thing is happening at other presses too. So I'd be very interested to hear from any of the others of you sort of what work is being done in that area in terms of editorial boards and peer review. John.
I can say, yeah, a little bit about our peer review process. We're intentionally flexible, not only in who does peer review and, in terms of their identity and expertise, but also the stage at which we do it. And mostly that's both at acquisition time, we do that sometimes, and then sometimes and almost always we do it as part of the development process of the manuscript. And I know sometimes that surprises authors who've published elsewhere and are used to it happening one or the other place. But I guess I would recommend the flexibility. That's really the word that comes to mind there. That given the project, your main questions as a publisher and even as an author may be right on the front end before you even get started, or they may be much deeper in once the cement is poured but still wet. I think that we're able then to invite peer reviewers of the right sort. So for instance, a book may be primarily, we've got one in the works now that's primarily from for clergy and for liturgical settings, but it has a major psychological component. And so I'm prioritizing recruiting a licensed clinical psychologist as a peer reviewer on that process, rather than having a fixed editorial board that may or may not have that kind of expertise. I really love being able to pull just about any tool, out of the workshop for the right task.
Thank you for that. Cade or David, do you want to add any other thoughts?
Yeah, I'll chime in there and just kind of build on what John was saying. Yeah, the flexibility with peer review, that is important to us as well. So one of the benefits of Baylor Press being a pretty small shop publisher, we only publish about 40 books a year. But we have the luxury of giving very personalized attention to each project. And it's one of our most cherished values is this intense personalism that we establish with our authors. So especially in an area like this, where it's so important to respect uniqueness of situations, of perspectives, being able to give that personalized attention to meet the author where they are, and to really come in alongside them, walk with them through the entire process. Each author, each book is its own unique case, its own special project. So yeah, that's extremely important to us. So I appreciate John chiming in there for that.
Great, thank you. Do any of you have any thoughts or questions you want to add in at this point? We've got about 6 minutes left before the break. And if not, I've got one. I noticed, Laura, you mentioning about your market being primarily libraries. So I would be interested just to hear from the other three publishers we've got represented here, sort of a broad brush description of your markets. Just betraying my business background here, but I'd be interested to know sort of what your main markets are. Should we start with John? Is that okay? Just because you're at the top of my screen.
Yeah, it's a great question and always a challenging one throughout every stage, from the proposal and acquisition stage onward, to make sure that we're communicating clearly within the team internally over the long months and even years that a book is in development and production, and then of course communicating effectively with potential markets. Our range is this is another facet of the diversity of our publishing program, that we often our readership may be an individual reader, a lay reader, even for a book that sort of crosses over to a general readership. And then libraries, but some books really are like, oh, this is a library book, let's make sure it's published in a nice durable binding that the librarians will love, that we make it fit into our sort of subscription program for libraries buying direct from us, and really everything in between. Some books, the reader will be an undergraduate student who's been assigned the book, but they're probably not choosing and buying it. It's their professor that we need to communicate and make sure they're understanding that this is going to be a great book to use as a core textbook or as a supplemental textbook. So I would say, depending on the project, it's all over the place for us.
Thank you. David, what would you say?
I mean, my answer would be very similar. I think we sort of situate ourselves somewhere in that kind of edge between church and academy, which naturally means a big chunk of our market is theological colleges, particularly here in the UK, but worldwide. But not exclusively. We have plenty of kind of individuals buying books, depending on what they are, and we do have a kind of more academic end of the list. It's not where we major the research library market, but it is there as an option. I think a lot of authors come to us, having completed the book that they wanted as their sort of initial, Brill style book going on at an academic library, and then they want something that kind of meets a kind of market that is going to use it in a more immediate way, and there's a value for both. But I think that's probably how a lot of authors see us, certainly. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
Thank you. Cade?
Yeah, so I will say libraries make up a substantial component of our financial base, certainly. We work very closely with libraries, especially here in the States. But on the philosophical level, our key target audience, it's academics working in theology and biblical studies and religious studies generally. Christian universities, seminaries. That's what we're really targeting. Occasionally our books will cross over, so they're more accessible to laypersons or practitioners, ministers. But yeah, we are very self-consciously and deliberately an academic press. So that's our identity. Yeah.
Thank you. And Laura, I'm conscious I've spoken for you. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, you're absolutely right. Primarily libraries, institutional libraries is absolutely our key focus. We publish books and journals and online reference works. So they're big, expensive products. And for that postgraduate and above level of study. So we're very different to the much more accessible work that my colleagues here are generally working on. So yeah.
Super, thanks so much. Well, that's brought us nicely to time for this little bit of the session. So we'll take a 15-minute break now. I can see that questions are already coming in. And so after the break, we'll have a chance to address that. For participants who haven't put your questions in yet, you're reminded that it's possible to submit questions anonymously. And there are instructions on how to do that on the email that came out to you yesterday. And also just a reminder to be considerate and respectful of other people's views, even if you don't agree with them. Please bear in mind that our panelists this evening are not necessarily specialists in autism and may not be aware of all the ongoing discussions that we've touched on in our sessions today. particularly about language and the social or medical models of autism. So just bear that in mind as you pose your questions, and we'll reconvene at 5:15. Thank you, everyone. Hello, just like to welcome everyone back for our last few minutes together. So just before we get started on the questions, I would like to invite attendees to take a look in the chat where some of our publishers have shared their email addresses and their contact details if you're interested in an ongoing conversation with them. So just to draw your attention that is there, and also that following the feedback we had this morning, the questions will be published in the order that they come in the chat. So because I understand the order of them was moving around this morning, which caused people a bit of a headache. So if you follow it in the chat, they will come in the correct order there rather than on the Q&A feature, as I understand it. There are some very busy people behind the scenes making that happen. So thank you to those of you doing that. Super. So having a look through the questions that we've had, it looks to me like they fall into two broad categories, which is quite helpful, not unrelated categories. One is about why autism and publishing on autism is considered sort of niche, and how or should we make it more mainstream. And the other category that I think I can see there is questions related to power and the accessibility of the publishing process to those who perhaps aren't in powerful positions, are not church leaders or academics or parents or, you know, sort of people who have often spoken for autistic people. So if we take those two categories in order, the first question is that we'll take a look at, has moved around on my screen too, 1 second. I'd like to see more disability or autistic theology included in more mainstream topical books. I hate how niche some people seem to view our topic to be. It's a form of segregation to stick all reflections on the disabled or autistic experience into a book that only looks at that area. Fewer people will read it. Do you agree, or are there some good examples that contradict what I'm saying? How can we make our topic and reflection more accessible to people who don't have a significant interest or personal experience of autism and faith? And there's a couple of other questions that sort of go in that direction. So would anybody like to volunteer to share some thoughts on that?
I don't mind starting if that's helpful. Two things. First would be absolutely. I mean, I completely agree. I think there is I think, as I said earlier, I think there is a real risk that we, the books pigeonhole areas and make people feel like what they're talking from is niche. And actually, I look at some of the textbooks we were publishing sort of 20 years ago, and there's always a risk in general textbooks on theology that they have a sense that what they're essentially doing is a kind of a non-contextualized norm, and you might have a specific chapter for a specific sort of contextual area, and I think we're definitely looking to rethink how we do, for example, a theology textbook so that it doesn't sort of take that approach. I think the other thing, if publishers, particularly in theology or religion, talk about a particular niche, I think it's worth remembering that it is all a niche. That actually, particularly in a UK context where the churches and theology is a relatively small area, we are niche publishers anyway. So even the most general theology textbook, I would talk of as niche, simply because that's the reality of the area, and our particular gift as publishers is our specialism. Our focus is on learning to make niches work, so small print runs work and those sorts of things. So I suppose that'd be my two responses. But I think that's a great question. It's one that I think we need to learn how to deal with better, and how, not to make people feel that their particular area is somehow too specialist.
Thank you, David. Does anybody else want to share any thoughts on that? John?
Yeah, one of the words that sticks out to me in the question, which is, I would echo much of what David said, really everything that David said. But the word that jumps out to me from the question is segregation, which is a good and powerful and sobering way to look at it. That is certainly what publishers mustn't do. So I'm heartened by the conversation earlier about the example. Was it McCaskill's book is not in the disability series? That would be a good example, but it would apply also down to like even the chapter or paragraph or sentence level within other books too, where a topic like autism or neurodiversity generally, or disability for that matter, can come up. And when an author is thoughtful and engaged meaningfully with a topic, whether it looks like that's going to be part of the main title or subtitle of their book or not, I just could not agree more that that's really powerful. When the segregation happens, that it's like, oh, this is treated as if it's something so strange that nobody else could possibly be interested in it, that's when it's really dangerous. But sort of the flip side of it, a positive way to look at it would be, well, no, we're focused on this topic. There is a time when you do need a whole book on a focused topic. You might even need a whole series. And that's a matter of how the author and publisher are communicating that too, to make sure it doesn't look like we're building walls to keep people out, but rather we're quietly attending for the time being to this one topic within the covers of this book, would be a more fruitful way to explain it, at least.
Thank you. That's nice to get that different perspective on it there, to look at it from that other direction. Any thoughts from Laura or Cade?
Yeah, I am in complete agreement, and I am sensitive to that. Just like with our series on disability, it's never been our intention to silo these conversations. That it's the exact opposite. We're platforming. We're trying to bring visibility to these and to diffuse these conversations into the broader conversations of the church and the academy at large. But yeah, these are important considerations to keep in mind moving forward. And with these areas, autism and disability in general, these are areas that we're still growing and learning in, and we're still trying to bring more visibility to and platform them in faithful ways. So, yeah.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, I agree with what my colleagues have said. Nothing particularly to add to that.
That's great. And actually, in doing so, you've kind of led us on quite nicely to the next kind of broad area of questions, which is about the power and where power is located in the publishing process. So a question that's come in, David spoke about needing to work closely with academics, churches, and those at the leading edge. And actually, indeed, most of you sort of touched on that. Does this not run the risk of institutionalizing power? How do you make space for the prophetic voices? Would anybody like to come in on that question?
Well, that's a brilliant question. I think it so much of it for me comes from being creative. So we could say, well, let's just stick to going to the conferences and finding voices that way. But of course, plenty of people can't afford or aren't for other reasons able to be at conferences. We could say, we'll look at Twitter and find plenty of voices, and that's a very powerful commissioning thing. But there are plenty of good reasons not to be on Twitter, frankly. So, any of these approaches, we've always got to be aware of those people for whom that is a power structure that they can't access or otherwise don't want to access. I'd say one thing that we've done is something we call Theology Slam, which is a competition we ran particularly with speaking in mind, communicating via speech, but actually it's led to some projects from authors and some it's something we'd like to develop more. It isn't perfect. We still aren't quite finding the voices we want to find through that, but running those sorts of sort of initiatives to try and encourage those voices, find those voices. We kind of rely on you as well a little bit in pointing us to who those people are. So those voices that we're missing, often you may well know them and we don't. That's a sort of waffly first answer, but someone's got a better one, I'm sure.
Thank you, though, David. Anyone else want to come in on that?
So I will say, so again, taking our disability series, several of the authors in that series are, they're not just academics, they're also practitioners, they're chaplains, they're serving in churches. And so having those authors that are positioned at those intersections, that is really helpful because they are on the ground, they're doing this work, they are applying this scholarship to real world needs. But yeah, like David said, we rely on our colleagues in the academy who are out there in the world, in the field, doing this important work, really, applying this research, the scholarship. We as editors, we don't see the landscape in the way that you do. Obviously, we don't want to remain stuck in the ivory tower. That is not our goal. We really rely on those relationships to keep us in touch with these conversations.
Any other thoughts on that one? And if not, we'll move on to a related question then, because you're talking about sort of coming to your pastors and your academics as sort of intermediaries, almost the ones who are out there sort of working with different groups of people. But more than one person is asking about the accessibility of the publishing process, the clarity of it, the expense of things like open access. If you're not part of an academic institution or a church denomination or body, finding funding for things like that is difficult. So, are there ways that you can kind of make that process clearer? Are there ideas that you can suggest for those who are not formally part of these bodies or institutions that can make things happen like that? Laura.
Yeah, shall I? So there's various different parts of that question. I'll try and take them in succession. In terms of making the publication process more clear and more accessible to people, we try and reach people in lots of different ways. We have all the information on our website. We run workshops, sometimes in person, not so much at the moment, and online. We go to conferences. We try to be available by email. So we try to be available to people in the way that will work for them and to communicate with them as will be most effective for them. There's probably more we can do on that front, but we're open to suggestions. We're at the end of a phone or an email or a Zoom if people want to tell us what would work for them. In terms of accessibility of content, which is a huge issue, particularly from where I'm standing at Brill, where our prices are very high, whereas I'm sure it's very different for my colleagues here. We've been working really hard to make open access more available to people because the basic article processing charge and book publication charges are very high. We've been developing transformative agreements with different library consortia. So, for example, if you're in the UK and your library is part of the JISC consortia or the Schedule in Scotland. So, for example, people at the University of Aberdeen, if you're affiliated to Aberdeen, you can read all Brill Journal articles for free, and you can publish in the Brill Journal in open access for free. So there's different ways we can advise on for people who are outside of institutions, how they might secure funding, whether from a funding body or for a sponsor or crowdfunding. And we work with organisations like Knowledge Unlatched to achieve funding for projects that are in progress. For people who are maybe in the global south, where this is an even more pressing issue, this accessibility of material, we work with different organisations like Electronic Information for Libraries, the Adopt for Library scheme, and different organisations to try and disseminate more content to either waive article processing charges or offer reduced rates, to bundle journals and make content more available and accessible. So there's lots of different schemes and projects and organisations that we're involved in, but it's lots of threads going, and we're trying, and we're always open to suggestions.
Laura, thank you. That was brilliant. Piles of practical advice there. It sounds to me like the general theme is, if folks get in touch with you or with your the other representatives here with those kind of queries, you'll be able to direct them to some advice and guidance. We're a little bit over time, but I haven't. The other three, you've not had an opportunity just to speak to that question. Was there anything burning that you wanted to add to what Laura said? No? Excellent. Great. Well, just remains for me to thank you, four of you, very much for coming and doing this panel for us today. It's been really, really helpful and insightful. And to remind attendees that the Wonder Room is available for sort of online socializing after the session. So do head over there if you want to mingle, as we would do at an in-person conference. Don't miss out. And we look forward to seeing you there, or tomorrow morning when we begin again at 11 a.m. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This was great.